It begins, as all good lies do, with a body that refuses to tell the same story twice. At Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas, the doctors who first received the president described a wound at the back of the head, a gaping exit cavity, ragged and unmistakable, the kind of injury that speaks of a bullet entering from the front. More than a dozen physicians and nurses, trained men and women who handled gunshot wounds every week of their working lives, signed off on the same observation. The throat wound, they said, looked like an entrance, small and clean, not the violent tear of an exit. Dr. Malcolm Perry told reporters as much, on camera, hours after the shooting. He would later be persuaded to remember things differently. By the time the body arrived at Bethesda Naval Hospital that night, the wounds had changed. The back of the head was now intact, or nearly so. The damage had migrated to the right side, the top, the front, anywhere, in fact, but where the Dallas doctors had seen it. The autopsy was conducted not by forensic pathologists experienced in homicide, but by naval officers under the direct gaze of generals and admirals who had no business in the room. Notes were burned in a fireplace. Photographs were taken, then retaken, then sealed. And then there is the brain. The president's brain, removed during autopsy, was placed in a stainless steel container and logged into evidence. It was meant to be examined, weighed, sectioned, photographed in detail. Instead, sometime in the years that followed, it simply vanished. No chain of custody, no final report. A piece of the most photographed head in American history. Gone, as though it had never been there at all. Consider what this means. Two sets of doctors, hundreds of miles apart, describing two different bodies on the same afternoon. Photographs that contradict eyewitnesses. X-rays that experts have called retouched. A brain that disappears from a federal vault. Either the wound moved, which is impossible, or the body did not match the descriptions because, at some point between Dealey Plaza and that autopsy table, the body being described was not the same body at all. The official record asks us to accept that a dozen trained physicians in Dallas simply got it wrong, all of them, in the same way, at the same time. It is a remarkable thing to ask. It is, in fact, the kind of thing one only asks when there is something far stranger that cannot be admitted. Because the question raised by the missing brain and the migrating wound is not really a medical question. It is a question about the chain of evidence and what that chain was protecting. If a casket arrived at Bethesda containing something other than what the Dallas doctors had seen, a different body, a substituted body, or no body of consequence at all, then the autopsy was not an examination. It was a performance, staged for a record that needed to exist. And if the medical record was rewritten in the hours after Dallas, by men in uniform, in a locked room, with notes feeding a fire, then one has to ask, gently and without flinching, what else was rewritten that night? The flight manifests, the hospital logs, the casket itself, the story of where and how and whether the 35th President of the United States actually died. To understand what happened in Dallas, you have to understand how many people, by the autumn of 1963, had reason to want the young president dead, and how few of them, in the end, were the ones who mattered. Begin with the Central Intelligence Agency. The Bay of Pigs had been a wound that never closed. Kennedy had inherited a half-built operation, watched it collapse on a Cuban beach, and refused to send in the air cover the planners had quietly assumed he would. He had then fired Allen Dulles, the agency's founding god, and promised, in a famous private remark, to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. The men he meant to splinter heard him clearly. Some of them, veterans of the wartime services, considered themselves the true continuity of American power, and the president a reckless boy playing with their machinery. Add to them the organized crime families who had been told, through back channels during the campaign, that a Kennedy administration would be friendly to their interests. Instead, the president's brother, the Attorney General, had launched the most aggressive prosecution of the mob in American history. In Chicago, in New Orleans, in Tampa, names were spoken in private rooms: Giancana, Marcello, Trafficante, and the verdicts in those rooms required no jury. Add the Hawks. Kennedy had stared down his own Joint Chiefs during the Cuban Missile Crisis, refusing the strike they demanded. He had signed a test ban treaty with Moscow, and in October of 1963, in National Security Action Memorandum 263, he had ordered the first withdrawal of American advisors from Vietnam. For men who had built careers on the certainty of a long war in Asia, this was not policy. It was treason in slow motion. Add the oil men of Texas, watching the president move to end the depletion allowance. Add the segregationists, watching him send troops into Mississippi. Add the Federal Reserve theorists, the anti-Castro Cubans, the defectors of every flag. By the autumn of '63, the list of those who wished John Kennedy gone was not a list. It was a constellation. But here is where the official story flattens what should be a stranger picture, because not everyone inside that world wanted him erased. Within the same agencies that housed his enemies, there were quieter men, career officers who had served under his father's old friends, who had watched Kennedy face down the chiefs in October '62 and seen, perhaps for the first time, a president willing to refuse a war. These men understood something the public did not. They understood how many separate plots were already in motion. They had read the intercepts. They had run the surveillance. They knew, with operational certainty, that the president was going to die in Dallas, or in Miami, or in Chicago, and that no Secret Service detail in the world was going to stop it. For such men, the question was no longer whether Kennedy could be saved. It was whether he could be lost in a way that satisfied his enemies and preserved the man. This is the premise that the official record cannot contain, that somewhere in the late summer or early autumn of '63, a small circle inside the intelligence community, not the faction that hated him, but a quieter one that valued him, made a decision of extraordinary audacity. If the assassins could not be stopped, the assassination would have to be staged. The plotters would be allowed to believe they had won. The country would be allowed to grieve. And the president, the actual living man, would have to disappear so completely that even his widow would weep at the grave. The only way to save him, they decided, was to kill him. An operation of this scale does not assemble itself. It requires an author, one mind, or one very small room of minds, capable of holding the whole architecture in view. Among the names that have circled this story for decades, one keeps returning, in the careful way that certain names do when the people who knew the most have died and the people who knew a little are finally willing to speak. Call him, for the moment, the planner. He was a senior officer of the clandestine service, a man whose career stretched from the wartime services through every major covert operation of the early Cold War. He had run agents in occupied Europe. He had helped engineer the removal of governments in Iran and Guatemala. He had, by the early 1960s, become one of the principal architects of Operation Mongoose, the labyrinthine effort against Castro that drew together the agency, the mob, the exile networks, and a handful of trusted men inside the Kennedy White House. He knew, in other words, every player on every side of the board. He had built half of them. And he had something rarer than knowledge. He had access. He moved between the Attorney General's private meetings and the safe houses of men who were, on paper, his targets. He had stood in rooms with the president himself in those long evenings when the White House emptied and the harder conversations began. There is reason to believe he was one of the few men in Washington whom both Kennedy brothers trusted, and one of the few whose loyalty, on the question of the president's life ran deeper than his loyalty to any agency. Consider what such a man would have needed to do. He would have needed a double, a man of the right age, the right build, the right injuries available on the right day, and the right circle of family willing to be silent for a lifetime in exchange for whatever was promised. He would have needed control over the motorcade route, or at least over the men who controlled it. He would have needed compliance or confusion inside the Secret Service detail. He would have needed a hospital, a flight, a casket, an autopsy team that would not ask the questions trained pathologists would have asked. He would have needed a patsy already prepared, already filed, already shadowed by enough strange paperwork that no investigator would ever entirely believe the simple story. Above all, he would have needed the cover of other plots. This is the subtle genius of the thing. By the autumn of '63, there were, by serious estimate, at least 3 independent conspiracies converging on the president's life. The planner did not have to invent an assassination. He only had to let one happen, visibly, loudly, with a body and a shooter and a nation watching, while quietly removing the man himself from the center of it. The killers would believe they had succeeded. The investigators would chase them in circles for 60 years. And the only people who would know the truth would be a handful of men sworn to a secrecy deeper than any oath of office. Did such a man exist? The records that might answer the question were burned or sealed, or are still being withheld decades past their statutory release. What can be said is that the operation in Dallas bears the fingerprints of a particular kind of mind, patient, theatrical, fluent in the management of competing factions, comfortable with the use of one conspiracy to mask another. It is not the work of a lone gunman. It is not even the work of a single hostile cell. It is the work of someone who understood that the surest way to hide a living president was inside the spectacle of a dead one. And once such a mind had been set to the problem, the question was no longer whether the thing could be done. The question was where, exactly, the president would be when the shots in Dealey Plaza rang out, and whose hands would be waiting for him on the other side. Read the official report, and Dallas becomes a sequence of accidents. Read it again, knowing what to look for, and Dallas becomes a play. Every misfortune lands on its mark. Every oversight occurs precisely where an oversight is needed. The curtain rises at Love Field a few minutes after 11:30 in the morning, and from that moment forward, nothing that goes wrong by chance. Begin with the route. The motorcade had been published in the Dallas papers days earlier, and it did not include the turn onto Elm Street. The original path took the president straight down Main, through the heart of downtown, past the cheering office workers and out toward the Trade Mart luncheon. Then, in the final hours, the route was altered. A jog onto Houston, a sharp, almost impossible left onto Elm, a turn so tight that the limousine would have to slow to roughly 11 miles an hour to make it, directly beneath the windows of a 6-story warehouse where, by extraordinary coincidence, a former defector with a paper trail of intelligence connections had been employed for the last 5 weeks. Stage cue. Mark hit. Then the bubble top. The Lincoln Continental carried a clear plastic canopy that could be fitted over the passenger compartment in case of weather. It was not bulletproof, but it would have distorted any shooter's sightline and complicated the geometry of every theory written since. The morning of November 22nd, the Dallas skies were overcast, and a light rain had fallen. Standard procedure called for the top to be installed. The order came down, from somewhere, that it be removed. By the time the motorcade reached Main Street, the sun was out, and the president sat fully exposed, framed against the open sky like a figure in a painting. Stage cue. Mark hit. Then the security. Photographs from earlier stops on the trip, Fort Worth, San Antonio, Houston, show Secret Service agents riding on the rear bumper of the limousine, 2 on each side, their bodies forming a shield around the president. In Dallas, those agents were pulled back. Film exists of one agent, Henry Ribka, gesturing in evident confusion as he is waved off the car at Love Field. The follow-up vehicle stayed several car lengths behind. The motorcycle outriders, normally positioned at the rear quarters of the limousine, were thinned to 2 and pushed further back still. The president rode through Dealey Plaza in a moving frame from which every obstruction to a clean shot had been quietly, methodically removed. Stage cue, mark hit. And then the patsy. Lee Harvey Oswald had been placed in the Texas School Book Depository in October, weeks before the route through Dealey Plaza existed on any official document. A young man with a defector's biography, a Russian wife, a tangle of intelligence contacts in New Orleans and Mexico City, and a paper trail so contradictory that investigators are still arguing about it. He was not chosen because he was a shooter. He was chosen because he was a story already half-written, ready to be finished the moment the shots were fired. None of this, taken alone, proves anything. Routes are changed, tops are removed, agents are reassigned, employees are hired. But the official version asks us to accept all of it at once, on the same morning, in the same 6-block stretch of one American city, by chance. That is not coincidence. That is choreography. Someone, somewhere, was reading from a script, and the president, smiling and waving in the open car, was the only man on the stage who had not been given his lines. A dressmaker named Abraham Zapruder stood on a concrete pedestal at the north edge of the plaza, raised his 8mm Bell and Howell to his eye, and filmed the most studied 6 seconds of footage in human history. 26.5 seconds of color film, 486 frames. Within them, depending on which expert you trust, either the lone gunman theory or its complete demolition. Watch it the way the official story asks you to, and you see a tragedy. Watch it as choreography, and you begin to see the cues. The limousine emerges from behind the Stemmons freeway sign at frame 225. The president's hands rise to his throat, the so-called Thorburn response, an involuntary clutch at the neck. It looks like a man hit by a bullet. It also looks, frame by frame, like a man following a rehearsed motion, head lowered, elbows out, hands rising in a way that conveniently masks the face from the camera's opposite. There is no spray of blood. There is no exit wound visible on the front of his suit. There is a man performing the universal pantomime of being shot in a moment when the world is about to be told he has been. Then, the headshot, frame 313. The famous, sickening jolt. A pink halo erupts from the right side of the skull. The head snaps violently back and to the left, and Jacqueline Kennedy climbs across the trunk to retrieve what appears to be a fragment of her husband. To anyone watching the film, it is the moment of death itself, recorded in color, undeniable. And yet, read it again. A halo that bright, that uniform, that visible from every angle, is consistent with a small pyrotechnic charge, a squib, the kind used in film work since the 1950s, concealed in the hairline and detonated on a radio cue. The head snap, long held as proof of a frontal shot from the grassy knoll, is equally consistent with a trained subject executing a sharp recoil on command. The limousine itself, by this instant, has slowed almost to a stop. The follow-up car has fallen back. The wall of agents is gone. Every camera in the plaza has, for those decisive seconds, a clean view of one man, and one man only. For this to work, of course, there had to be a body. Not the president's, a double. Call him the stand-in, The man whose face, height, and bearing matched closely enough that the cameras of 1963, with their grainy resolution and uncertain color, would never see the difference. He was not a stranger plucked from a crowd. He was a long-prepared asset, perhaps a terminally ill volunteer, perhaps a man whose family was offered a future that no honest job could ever provide. Perhaps both. The records, if they ever existed, were among the first to burn. Imagine the conversation. A small room, a senior officer across the table from a dying man with children. Your country needs you. Your name will never be spoken. Your family will be cared for in ways you cannot imagine. There will be one moment in a car on a sunny afternoon in Texas. After that, you will be a hero no one ever knows. The stand-in, if he existed, would have been moved into position in the pre-dawn hours, dressed in a duplicate of the president's suit, fitted with the small charge, and seated in the limousine at some point between Love Field and the turn onto Houston Street. Where the real president went in those minutes is a question for the chapter that follows. 6 seconds, 486 frames. A piece of choreography so perfect that the world has spent more than 60 years studying it without ever quite believing what it actually shows. The moment the headshot detonated, the operation entered its most dangerous phase. A staged death is only as convincing as the body that follows it, and the body that arrived at Bethesda that night had to be either the stand-in, prepared and modified for the autopsy, or no body at all, only the careful illusion of one, sealed inside a casket no one was permitted to open. Either way, the man at the center of it, the actual living president, had to be moved off the stage before anyone counted the cast. The first irregularity is the casket itself. At Parkland, the body was placed in a heavy bronze ceremonial coffin, purchased that afternoon for some $4,000. By the time it arrived at Bethesda Naval Hospital, the body, according to the testimony of multiple witnesses inside the morgue, was inside a plain gray shipping casket, of the kind used for military remains, and was wrapped in a body bag rather than the sheets in which it had left Dallas. 2 caskets, 2 different containers, 2 different wrappings, 1 official trip. The honor guard that carried the bronze casket off Air Force One at Andrews carried something that weighed, by their later accounts, considerably less than a man. The plain shipping casket, meanwhile, was logged into Bethesda through a separate entrance by a separate crew, some 20 minutes before the official arrival the cameras were filming. 2 caskets means 2 routes, and 2 routes means that somewhere between Parkland and Bethesda, the chain of custody on the body of the President of the United States quietly forked into 2 parallel paths, only one of which the public was ever allowed to see. Now consider the flight. Air Force One left Love Field at 2:47 in the afternoon, Central Time. The official narrative is a direct flight to Andrews. The recorded radio traffic, however, tells a stranger story. A series of cryptic exchanges with an unidentified party referred to only as Liberty. Conversations about flight paths that wandered. Fuel calculations that did not quite match the published route. The transcripts that survive are incomplete. The original tapes, like so many other documents in this case, have been described variously as lost, destroyed, or never to have existed in the form witnesses recall. There is a small airfield in East Texas, and another in southern Virginia, and a third in rural Maryland, each of which would have been reachable that afternoon by a smaller aircraft flying low and quiet. There are men, since deceased, who claimed to have refueled an unmarked plane that day, under instructions to ask no questions and file no log. There is a private medical facility, the name of which appears in none of the official records, but in several of the unofficial ones, that received a patient by ambulance late that evening. A man in his mid-40s, dark-haired, sedated, with a fresh and superficial wound at the hairline and a chronic condition of the lower back consistent with a famous Assassination patient long under steroid treatment. None of this can be proven. All of it can be denied. That is the architecture of a successful disappearance. You do not need to leave no trace. You need to leave too many traces, all of them slightly wrong, so that the search becomes the cover. By midnight on November 22nd, the world believed the president was dead. Somewhere, in a quiet room with the blinds drawn, breathing slowly under the watch of men he had trusted with his life, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was beginning the longest exile in American history. The official Lee Harvey Oswald is a man assembled from contradictions and then asked with a straight face to make sense. A high school dropout who taught himself functional Russian. A Marine private who somehow held a security clearance and worked at Atsugi Air Base in Japan, the launching field for the U-2 spy plane program. A defector to the Soviet Union who walked into the American embassy in Moscow, renounced his citizenship, threatened to hand over military secrets, and then, 2.5 years later, walked back into the United States without so much as a debriefing or a charge. The official Oswald is impossible. The operational Oswald makes perfect sense. He was an asset. The pattern of his life describes it more clearly than any confession could. The Marine intelligence training, the studied Russian, taught in a language program no enlisted man stumbles into by accident. The defection that produced no consequences. The Russian wife, whose uncle was a colonel in Soviet intelligence, delivered back to the United States with him as cleanly as a diplomatic pouch. The return to a network of handlers in Dallas and Fort Worth, white Russian émigrés with their own deep ties to the agency. A petroleum geologist named George de Mohrenschildt, men whose social calendars do not include defectors by chance. Then, the summer of 1963 in New Orleans. Oswald rents an office at 544 Camp Street, in a building that also houses the detective agency of Guy Bannister, a former senior official of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, now running anti-Castro operations out of the same address. He hands out pro-Castro leaflets on Canal Street, stamped with the Camp Street address. He stages a street confrontation with anti-Castro Cubans that lands him, conveniently, on local radio and television. He is, by any reading, being built. A legend, in the trade term, a documented identity, complete with a public face, ready to be activated. He went to Dallas believing, almost certainly, that he was inside an operation. Perhaps he thought he was helping to expose a plot. Perhaps he thought he was part of a sting that would end with handshakes and a quiet reassignment. He told his Russian wife, in the days before, that he expected to be a great man. He did not behave like a man preparing to commit murder. He behaved like a man preparing for a role whose ending had not been explained to him. When the shots were fired, the role was finished. He left the depository, was stopped by a patrolman, returned to his rooming house, was apprehended in a movie theater under circumstances that suggested he was expecting contact. By the time he understood that the contact was not coming, he was already in a Dallas police basement, telling a reporter, on camera, with the calm of a man waiting for a signal, that he was a patsy. He had less than 48 hours to live. Jack Ruby was the cleanup. A nightclub owner with a long resume of small favors for the Chicago outfit, friendships with Dallas police officers. A personal address book whose pages included names that should not have shared a binding. He walked down a ramp the police had supposedly secured, raised a snub-nosed .38, and shot Oswald in the abdomen in front of every camera in America. The louder loose end was silenced by the quieter one. Ruby died of cancer in 1967 in a Dallas hospital after begging on the record to be moved to Washington, where he could speak safely. He told a small circle of visitors in the final months that the world would never know the true facts of what had occurred, that the men who knew everything, and that the men who did not know would never be allowed to learn. A cover is not a single act. A cover is a structure. The shots in Dealey Plaza were the first act. The autopsy at Bethesda was the second. The Warren Commission, established by executive order 7 days after the president's death, was the third, and by far the most enduring. Look at who Lyndon Johnson appointed to it. Chief Justice Earl Warren himself, dragooned into the role over his own objections. Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, who privately told confidants for the rest of his life that he did not believe the report he signed. Allen Dulles, the director of Central Intelligence, whom Kennedy had fired in disgrace after the Bay of Pigs. Read that again. The man Kennedy had removed from the agency was placed on the commission charged with explaining the agency's relationship to Kennedy's death. He attended more sessions than any other commissioner. He shaped which witnesses were called, which questions were asked, which files were requested from his former subordinates. He was, in operational terms, supervising the investigation of his own former workplace into the death of a president he had every reason to resent. No author of fiction would dare to write the scene. It is in the public record. The commission's central problem was geometry. 3 shots, 6 seconds, 1 rifle, 1 gunman. But the wounds did not cooperate. The president had been hit, and Governor Connally, in the seat ahead of him, had also been hit. And the timing of the film made it almost impossible for one bolt-action rifle to have fired both shots in the interval available. So the commission, through the labor of a young staff attorney named Arlen Specter, produced the single bullet theory. 1 bullet, fired from above and behind, passing through the president's neck, exiting his throat, entering Connally's back, shattering a rib, exiting his chest, passing through his wrist, lodging in his thigh, and emerging, in nearly pristine condition, on a stretcher at Parkland. The trajectory required the bullet to perform 2 changes of direction in midair. The condition of the bullet defied every test the commission's own ballistic experts performed. It did not matter. The theory's purpose was not to be believed. Its purpose was to occupy. So long as the country argued about the angle of 1 bullet, no one was asking the prior question, whether the wounds being explained had been suffered by the man in whose name they were being investigated at all. And then there are the witnesses. In the years following the report, an extraordinary number of people associated with the events of November 22nd died under circumstances that ranged from the unfortunate to the impossible. Reporters who had pursued leads, mistresses of named figures, mob intermediaries, 2 of the Cuban exiles glimpsed in New Orleans that summer, a strip club dancer who had worked at Ruby's Club and was preparing to testify, heart attacks in healthy men in their 30s, suicides by means that required improbable contortions, single car accidents on straight roads. A British statistician calculated the odds against the cluster at something on the order of 100,000 trillion to 1. The figure is contested. The pattern is not. The Warren report did not end the investigation. It ended the questioning. That, in the architecture of any successful cover, is the difference that matters. He would have been 46 years old in the November of his disappearance. He would have been 49 when the first credible sighting was filed, in the summer of 1967, on a small island in the Cyclades. A Greek hotel clerk, decades later, told a visiting American journalist about a guest who had stayed 3 nights in a private villa on the island of Skorpios, Aristotle Onassis's island, in the years before Onassis married the president's widow. The guest was American, gaunt, walking with evident pain, attended by two silent men who took meals in their rooms. He did not give his name at check-in. The clerk, then a young man, had been a passionate Kennedy admirer in 1960. He swore on the saints of his church, half a lifetime later, that the face had been the face. The story has no proof and no witnesses but the clerk, who died in 2004. It is the kind of story that should be dismissed immediately. It is also the kind of story that, once you have read enough of them, you find it harder and harder to laugh at. There is the matter of the Swiss Clinic, a private sanatorium in the Vaud canton, run by a discreet family of physicians whose clientele included deposed monarchs and oil sheiks. Was reported by a former orderly in the 1970s to have housed, for nearly a decade, a long-term American patient referred to in internal paperwork only as Monsieur K. He was, by the orderly's account, in his 50s, recovering from facial surgery, suffering from chronic adrenal insufficiency, the condition known to physicians as Addison's disease. The same condition the 35th President of the United States had been quietly managed for since the late 1940s. The clinic's records for the relevant years were destroyed in a fire in 1981. The orderly recanted in the 1990s, then partially unrecanted on his deathbed. Make of it what you can. There is a guest at Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis's funeral in May of 1994, glimpsed by exactly one person, a Secret Service agent who had served on her detail in the 1980s, retired, and asked to attend in plain clothes among the mourners. He reported, in a letter to a colleague not opened until after his own death, that he had seen an elderly man standing alone at the edge of the trees beyond the cemetery, watching the burial through field glasses, attended at a respectful distance by two younger men whose bearing he recognized at once as protective detail. The old man, the agent wrote, had stood for the length of the committal and then turned and walked with great difficulty into the trees. The agent did not follow. He wrote that he understood in that moment that he was not meant to. And there are the hoaxes. The man on the beach in Mexico in 1978, whose photograph was sold to a tabloid and turned out to be a retired insurance executive from Toledo. The deathbed confession in 1989 from a former CIA contractor that collapsed under the lightest examination. The grainy figure in the background of a Beirut news segment in 1983. Most of them are nothing. A few of them are the kind of nothing that, year after year, refuses to entirely go away. A man who has been declared dead does not need to hide well. He only needs to be unbelievable. That, in the end, has been the surest protection of all. Imagine the first morning. A small room, the shutters closed against a light he cannot yet place by country, a bandage across the lower half of his face. The slow recognition, through the chemical fog of whatever they have given him for the pain, that the voice on the radio in the next room is speaking of him in the past tense. A nation is weeping for a man lying alive in a borrowed bed. Listening to his own eulogies. The surgeries would have come in stages. First, the face. A careful reshaping of the jaw, the cheekbones, the line of the nose, enough to fool a passing recognition without erasing the man entirely. Then the teeth. Then, over months, the slow alteration of the gait, easier than it might have been because the back that had tormented him since the war now required a cane in any case. A new accent learned the way an actor learns one, a Boston flattened into something mid-Atlantic, something European, something belonging nowhere. A new name on documents prepared long before the trip to Dallas by men who understood that the most convincing identity is one with a paper trail older than the moment it is needed. The hardest part would not have been the body. It would have been the children. Caroline, 6 years old in the November of his disappearance. John, 3, who saluted the passing casket on his 3rd birthday. He could not write to them. He could not telephone. He could not, even years later, send a single coded sign that would have given them the gift and the burden of knowing. A father who has chosen exile to save his life has chosen to be, in the only ways that matter to a child, dead. Whatever else the architects of his survival had spared him, they had not spared him this. He would have watched. That is the cruelty and the dignity of the thing. In June of 1968, in a kitchen pantry in Los Angeles, his brother Robert was shot in the head moments after winning the California primary. Whoever Kennedy was by then, wherever he was, a quiet villa, a clinic, a borrowed apartment in a city that did not know him, he would have learned of it on the same radios the rest of the world learned. He would have understood, in a way no one else could have understood, what it meant. The faction that had wanted him gone had not lost its appetite. It had simply turned the page. He would have watched the war he had ordered withdrawn from grow instead. 500,000 Americans in the jungles he had hoped to leave by 1965. He would have watched Saigon fall in 1975, on a television in some quiet room, perhaps alone. He would have watched, in July of 1969, a man named Armstrong step onto the moon. The promise he had made to a joint session of Congress in May of 1961, kept by other men, in his absence, in his name. Whatever he felt that night, sitting before a screen no one would ever photograph, belongs to him alone. The question that haunts this chapter of the story is whether he was a prisoner or a participant, whether the men around him were guards or companions, whether, in the long, quiet years, he ever asked to be allowed to come home and was told gently, firmly, that home no longer existed for him in any form he could survive. There are versions of this story in which he tried once and was persuaded back. There are versions in which he never tried. The truth, if there is one, is sealed inside a silence that has outlasted nearly everyone who could break it. Step away for a moment from the speculative and stand on ground that is fully documented. In October of 1992, the Congress of the United States passed, and President George H.W. Bush signed into law, the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act. The legislation was the result of a peculiar national mood. Oliver Stone's film had been released the previous year, and Americans, in numbers that startled their elected officials, had emerged from the theaters demanding to see the files. The act was the answer. Every government document related to the assassination would be gathered, cataloged, and released to the public. The deadline written into the law was 25 years from the date of passage, October of 2017. That deadline came and went. Some documents were released, many were not. Successive presidents of both parties signed orders postponing further release on grounds of national security, identifiable harm, or the protection of ongoing intelligence sources and methods. The Central Intelligence Agency, the institution one would naively expect to have the least interest in concealing the killing of a president, has been the most consistent voice for continued withholding. Their argument, made in court filings and in private letters to the National Archives, is that release of the remaining files would damage current operations. Pause on that. The events under discussion took place in 1963. The people directly involved are, with rare exceptions, dead. The sources cultivated in that period are, in any operational sense, long retired or in the grave. The methods of the early 1960s, wiretaps, mail covers, surveillance from windows across a street, are museum pieces. And yet, more than 60 years after Dallas, the agency that Kennedy promised to splinter into 1,000 pieces still maintains that some portion of what it knows cannot be told. What could remain that is worth the cost of this much resistance? The names of human sources still living would account for some redactions, but not for the volume. The protection of foreign liaison services would account for more, but again, not the volume. The most candid answer, offered occasionally by former officers in unguarded interviews and walked back the next morning, is that the files contain things that would not so much expose individual crimes as expose the shape of an institution, the architecture itself, the way decisions of that magnitude were actually made, and by whom, in the rooms that did not exist on any organizational chart. This is not proof of anything. It is not proof that Kennedy survived. It is not proof that there was a plot. It is not even proof that the documents contain what the most ambitious researchers hope they contain. But it is something quieter and harder to dismiss. It is the observable fact that, more than 6 decades after the event, an institution of the United States government continues to fight, year after year, lawsuit after lawsuit, executive order after executive order, to keep some part of the record of that afternoon in Dallas out of the daylight. A reasonable person is permitted to ask why. A reasonable person is permitted to notice that the question has never been answered. And a reasonable person is permitted, having read this far, to wonder whether the answer is being protected from foreign adversaries or from the people in whose name those documents were created in the first place. It surfaces, in the way these things surface, without warning and without provenance. A photograph posted to a forum few people read, by an account that disappears within hours. The image is grainy, perhaps a scan of a print, perhaps a frame pulled from old video. It shows a sunlit terrace, somewhere with cypress trees and a low stone wall, and beyond the wall, the bright, unmistakable blue of the Aegean, or the Adriatic, or some other sea that does not matter for what the photograph is doing. In the foreground, 3 figures at a table. 2 of them have the alert, slightly turned posture of men whose job is to watch the approaches. The third is an old man in a pale linen shirt, his face partially shadowed by the brim of a straw hat. He is reading a newspaper. The angle of his jaw is wrong for the man you are looking for. The set of his shoulders is right. There is nothing in the image, taken alone, that proves anything at all. Look closely. That is what these photographs always ask. Look closely. Lean toward the screen. Find the cheekbone you remember from the inaugural address. Find the hairline you remember from the bubble-top limousine. Find the smile that is not visible because the man in the picture is not smiling. The image rewards looking the way a Rorschach rewards looking. The longer you stare, the more certain you become of whatever it was you brought with you to the staring. Step back now. Pull the lens out from the photograph and from the villa and from the long speculative corridor we have walked together through 11 chapters of carefully arranged maybe. Consider the larger question. Whether or not John Kennedy stepped out of that limousine alive, whether or not he watched the moon landing from a borrowed room, whether or not he died decades later in a quiet bed under a name no historian will ever index, the story has had a life of its own, larger than the man and larger than the evidence, for more than 60 years. It will outlive every researcher currently chasing it. It will outlive, in all likelihood, the last redacted page in the last withheld file. Why? Because the story is not finally about Kennedy. It is about a country that watched its president killed on television and was handed, in the days that followed, an explanation that did not match what its own eyes had seen. It is about the long suspicion that the official version of any great event is not the true version, but the version one is permitted to know. It is about grief, and the refusal of grief, and the deep human reluctance to accept that a man so vivid could be reduced, in 6 seconds of bright Texas sunlight, to a closed casket and a flame on a hill in Arlington. If he survived, somewhere, somehow, then the worst thing did not quite happen. The country can still be the country it thought it was on the morning of November 22nd, 1963. That is the open door at the end of this corridor. not a verdict, not a confession. Not the photograph that ends the argument, only the possibility, kept alive by absence and silence and the documents that will not be released, that the story we were told is not the story that happened. Look closely, or, if you prefer, look away. The door remains open either way. It has been open for a very long time.